And what I want to do is introduce some basic terms. So the first term is clade. So if we look at this phylogeny here, just some basics about phylogenies. So phylogenies are a way of representing the evolutionary relationships between organisms. And so on the right, or at the tips of the tree, these are the extant lineages. And as we go back in time, we go back to more distant populations that existed in the past. And the idea is that when there's a branching in the tree, that represents what was initially one particular population or species or whatever that's now split into two. And so, for example, if we imagine that A, B, C, D, and E here are all different species, then at some point in time, X here, there was a species that split into two different populations that eventually went on and formed the extant species A and B that we see now, and etc., etc., if we go further and further back in time. So you can make phylogenetic trees out of kind of any taxonomic group. So these could be individual organisms in a population, they could be species, they could be, you can go as far as different domains of life. You can make phylogenetic trees with different domains of life. So it doesn't matter, you can do them for whatever groups, taxonomic groups of organisms you happen to choose. And the fundamental group of a phylogeny is this term clade. And so that's a group of taxa that share the same common ancestor. So for example, A and B, as I said, they all came from an initial common ancestral population that's indicated by X here. And so A and B form a nice clade that's defined by the split of this branch into these A and B. Similarly, we've got a clade that encompasses C, D, and E that's defined by this ancestor Y. So this ancestral, let's imagine it's a species, let's imagine these are species. So imagine this is an ancestral species that split into two populations that went on and formed species C, and then another one that then split again to form D and E, okay? So C, D, and E form a nice clade. D and E also form a nice clade because they are united by this common ancestor here. And A, B, C, D, and E also form a nice clade because they're united by this common ancestor here. So there's not just one clade in a phylogenetic tree. You can have multiple different clades at different levels. But for example, A, B, and C alone don't form a clade because there's no common ancestor that unites them to the exclusion of the other members of the tree. So what this means is that necessarily everything within a clade must be more related to each other than to anything else outside the clade. So A and B share a common ancestor here, so their most recent common ancestor is more recent than their most recent common ancestor with C, D, and E, which is all out here. Similarly, if we make a clade out of D and E, then its most common recent ancestor is here, and that is more recent than the common ancestor with C here. But you can make a clade with C, D, and E. That's just a clade that's defined by this common ancestor, etc., etc. And taxonomy essentially is describing the evolutionary relationships between organisms. Therefore, taxonomic groups should be the same as clades in an ideal world. Now, in reality, they're not, but what people in taxonomy are doing is trying to correct this as much as possible, and so try to make taxonomic groups equate to clades in a phylogeny. And one of the problems here is that particularly for microorganisms such as fungi, this is not really the case. And so, anybody, even I, can tell the difference between an animal and a plant, but telling the difference between different groups of fungi is often quite difficult. And so people often so the taxonomy is often in disagreement with the phylogeny, and it requires things to be renamed. And that's why you often see a lot of renaming of organisms in the fungi. Okay, if we go to the next slide, this is another term, monophyly. And monophyly is essentially the same as a clade, except that monophyly represents a taxonomic, or has a taxonomic meaning. So monophyly is where where a group forms a clade to the exclusion of everything else, and that group is a taxonomic name. So if we have, say, a genus that comprises species A and B, and then C, D, and E is a separate genus, then each of those genera would be monophyletic, because everything within that genus is within that clade, and everything within this genus is within this clade. So there's consistency between what we're calling a clade and our taxonomic name. And I think they say that here. So A and B are a monophyletic clade, C, D, and E are a monophyletic clade, D and E are a monophyletic clade, and A, B, C, D, and E are also a monophyletic clade. Oops. But for example, A, B, and C don't form a monophyletic clade because they are not grouped together to the exclusion of D and E in terms of their most recent common ancestor. So the most recent common ancestor of A, B, and C is over here, and that also includes D and E, which have that same most recent common ancestor.